My name is Scarlett, and when I was 16, my mother drove me deep into the Colorado Rockies for what she called a bonding camping trip. 3 days in, I woke up to find her gone. No note, no explanation, just tire tracks in the dirt and my backpack with enough food for maybe 2 days. I survived alone in those mountains for 8 days before a search team found me nearly dead from exposure and dehydration. But what I discovered about why she left me there would destroy our family forever. Hey everyone, before we dive into this incredible story of survival and family betrayal, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. If you are ready for a wild ride full of shocking twists and ultimate justice, smash that like button and hit subscribe because this story will leave you absolutely speechless. Trust me, you will want to see how this family drama unfolds and how karma finally catches up with the people who thought they could get away with the unthinkable. When the search and rescue team found me on that 8th day, I was barely conscious, lying in a makeshift shelter I had built from pine branches and my torn camping gear. My lips were cracked and bleeding, my hands covered in cuts from trying to catch fish in the stream with nothing but my bare hands and sharp rocks. The lead rescuer, a weathered man named Jake Morrison, later told me I was maybe 6 hours away from organ failure. My father Richard was waiting at the base camp when they carried me down the mountain on a stretcher. I remember his face was pale and drawn like he had aged 10 years in the 8 days I was missing. He kept apologizing over and over, saying he never thought Mom would actually go through with it. At first, I assumed he meant he never thought she would leave me alone accidentally, maybe getting lost herself or having car trouble. But as the days passed in the hospital recovering from severe dehydration and mild hypothermia, the pieces started falling into place in the most disturbing way possible. Mom never visited me once. Not once. Dad would make excuses saying she was too traumatized by what happened, too guilty to face me. The police had questioned her extensively about why she left me there, and her story kept changing. First, she claimed she went to get help when I got sick. Then she said she thought I was right behind her when she hiked back to the car. Finally, she settled on the story that she had gotten confused in the wilderness and accidentally left me at the wrong campsite. But here is what made my blood run cold. The campsite where she left me was not accessible by car. She would have had to hike me there deliberately, a 3-mile trek from where she parked. My younger brother Marcus, who was 14 at the time, was the one who finally told me the truth. He came to visit me in the hospital one evening when Dad had stepped out to get coffee. Marcus looked nervous, constantly glancing at the door like he was afraid someone would catch him talking. "Scarlett, I heard Mom on the phone before you guys left for the camping trip," he whispered, his voice shaking. "She was talking to someone about insurance money. She kept saying how it would look like an accident, how no one would ever suspect anything if you just disappeared in the mountains." The words hit me like a physical blow. My own mother had taken me into those mountains planning to abandon me to die. But why? What could possibly motivate a mother to essentially murder her own daughter? Marcus continued, his eyes filling with tears. She also said something about Dad's business problems, about how they needed money fast or they would lose everything. And she mentioned your college fund, how it was the only liquid asset they could access quickly. That night, after Marcus left and Dad returned with his coffee, I watched my father differently. His nervous energy, the way he could not quite meet my eyes, how he kept checking his phone constantly. When I asked him directly about their financial situation, he became defensive and changed the subject quickly. Over the next few days, I started paying attention to conversations that stopped when I entered a room, hushed phone calls that Dad would take in the hallway, and the way both my parents seemed to be walking on eggshells around each other. Mom finally came to visit me on my last day in the hospital, and the performance she put on was Academy Award worthy. She cried, she apologized, she held my hand and told me how grateful she was that I survived. But her eyes were cold, calculating. When she hugged me goodbye, she whispered in my ear something that chilled me to the bone. "You are stronger than I thought you would be, honey." But some people are not meant to survive everything life throws at them. That threat was delivered with such casual malice that I knew without a doubt Marcus had been telling the truth. This was not a mistake or an accident. This was attempted murder planned and executed by my own mother, with my father at minimum aware of what was happening. But I was 16 years old, recovering from trauma and facing adults who held all the power in my life. Who would believe me? How could I prove what had really happened in those mountains? As I was discharged from the hospital and returned to what was supposed to be my safe family home, I realized I was living with people who had tried to kill me and would probably try again if they thought they could get away with it. The next few weeks were a careful dance of pretending everything was normal while I tried to figure out how to protect myself and expose the truth. Mom went back to her routine of cooking family dinners and asking about my day, but I caught her watching me sometimes with an expression that was pure calculation. Dad threw himself into work even more than usual, and I noticed he had started drinking heavily in the evenings. Marcus became my only ally in that house, though I had to be careful not to put him in danger too. We developed a system of subtle signals and code words so we could communicate safely about what we were observing. He started keeping track of their phone calls, their comings and goings, and any conversations he could overhear about money or insurance. It was Marcus who discovered that Mom had taken out a substantial life insurance policy on me just 6 months before the camping trip, with herself as the beneficiary. The policy was for $500,000, which would have been more than enough to solve whatever financial crisis they were facing. And it was Marcus who found the printed emails in Dad's home office that revealed just how deep their money problems really went. 3 weeks after returning home from the hospital, I made the decision that would change everything. Instead of confronting my parents directly or going to the police with suspicions I could not prove, I decided to investigate them the way they had been plotting against me, carefully, methodically, and with a plan for gathering evidence that would be impossible to deny. My first breakthrough came when I convinced my best friend Jessica's older brother Tyler to help me. Tyler was 19, worked in IT, and had always been protective of me like an older brother. When I told him what I suspected, he was initially skeptical, but the insurance policy documents that Marcus had photographed convinced him that something was seriously wrong. Tyler helped me set up hidden recording apps on both my parents' phones while they were sleeping. He also installed tiny cameras in common areas of the house disguised as everyday objects. I felt guilty about spying on my own family, but then I would remember waking up alone in those mountains thinking I was going to die, and the guilt would evaporate. The recordings we captured over the next 2 weeks painted a picture of conspiracy that was far worse than I had imagined. Mom and Dad were not just in financial trouble. They were involved in something that could send them both to prison. Dad's construction company had been falsifying building inspections and using substandard materials for years. When a building partially collapsed in downtown Denver, injuring 3 people, the lawsuits and criminal investigation had begun. They owed over $2 million in legal fees, settlement costs, and back taxes. Dad faced potential prison time for criminal negligence. They had already secretly mortgaged our house, twice emptied their retirement accounts, and were facing bankruptcy. But here is where it got truly sick. They had calculated that my death would provide enough insurance money and sympathy to potentially delay their legal troubles while they figured out how to disappear. Mom's voice on the recordings was chillingly matter-of-fact as she discussed their options with Dad. If we had gone through with the original plan, we would have $500,000 right now, and everyone would be feeling sorry for us instead of investigating us, she said during one late-night conversation I recorded. Scarlett surviving ruined everything. Now we have to figure out another way. Dad's response was even worse. Maybe we can arrange another accident. Make it look like she never recovered from the trauma, like she hurt herself. Teenage suicide after a traumatic experience, it happens all the time. They were actively planning to kill me again, and this time they wanted to make it look like I had taken my own life. The betrayal was so complete, so devastating, that I had to lock myself in my bedroom and cry silently into my pillow for an hour just to process what I had heard. But anger, I discovered, can be incredibly motivating. These people who were supposed to love and protect me had not only tried to murder me once, they were planning to do it again. And they were discussing it like a business transaction, weighing the pros and cons of different methods to kill their own daughter. Tyler was horrified when I played him the recordings. "We have to go to the police right now," he said immediately. But I had been thinking about this constantly, and I knew that going to the police at this point might not be enough. Rich people with good lawyers had ways of making evidence disappear or getting charges reduced. I needed more than recordings of conversations. I needed evidence of their actual crimes that would put them away for decades. That is when I decided to become someone I never thought I could be: a person capable of elaborate deception and long-term revenge planning. If my parents could spend months plotting my death, I could spend months plotting their downfall. And I had advantages they did not know about. I knew they were planning to hurt me. I had recordings of them discussing it. And they still saw me as a helpless teenager who would never suspect what kind of people they really were. I started documenting everything. Every conversation, every phone call, every document I could access. Marcus helped by taking pictures of paperwork in Dad's office, while Tyler helped me understand the legal and financial implications of what we were discovering. We learned that Dad's company had cut corners on 12 different building projects, not just the one that had collapsed. We found evidence that Mom had been helping him doctor inspection reports and forge safety certifications. But I needed more than evidence of their existing crimes. I needed them to incriminate themselves in front of witnesses, to confess to trying to kill me, and to reveal the full scope of what they had done. I needed them to believe they were safe, that I suspected nothing, and that they could trust each other completely. So I started playing the role of the traumatized daughter who was slowly recovering from her wilderness experience. I talked to them about feeling grateful to be alive, about wanting to put the whole camping trip behind us and focus on family togetherness. I even suggested we should all go to therapy together to work through the trauma as a family. Mom ate this up, telling everyone how proud she was of my resilience and maturity. Dad seemed relieved that I was not asking difficult questions about what had really happened. They both became more relaxed around me, more willing to discuss their legal and financial problems openly because they assumed I was too young and too traumatized to understand the implications. During one family dinner, Mom actually said, "I think this whole experience has brought us closer together as a family. Sometimes terrible things happen for a reason, and we come out stronger on the other side." The audacity of her saying this while planning my second murder was breathtaking, but I just smiled and agreed with her. Meanwhile, Tyler had been researching everything we could about their legal situation, and he discovered something that changed everything. There was a federal task force investigating corruption in the construction industry, and Dad's company was already on their radar. If we could provide them with evidence of the falsified inspections and forged documents, it would trigger a much larger investigation that my parents would not be able to buy their way out of. The plan I developed over the next month was more complex than anything I had ever attempted in my life, but it had to be perfect because I would only get one chance to execute it. I needed to create a situation where my parents would confess to everything on camera in front of witnesses while simultaneously providing federal investigators with evidence of their construction fraud that would be impossible to dismiss or explain away. Tyler introduced me to his friend Amanda, who worked as a paralegal for a firm that specialized in federal criminal defense. When Amanda heard our recordings and saw our evidence, she immediately understood the gravity of the situation. She had connections with the federal task force investigating construction corruption, and she agreed to help us coordinate with them in exchange for exclusive access to all the evidence we had gathered. The timing had to be perfect. Amanda informed us that the task force was planning to raid several construction companies suspected of fraud, including Dad's company, within the next 6 weeks. If we could provide them with inside evidence before the raid, it would strengthen their case enormously. But we also needed to make sure my parents confessed to the attempted murder before they were arrested for the fraud, because once they were in custody, they would lawyer up immediately. I decided to host a family dinner party, ostensibly to celebrate my recovery and to show everyone that our family was stronger than ever after the camping trip ordeal. I invited my grandparents from both sides, my aunt and uncle, and Marcus's girlfriend, who had become like family to us. The idea was to create an environment where my parents would feel safe and celebratory, surrounded by family who loved and trusted them. Tyler and Amanda helped me set up recording equipment throughout the dining room and living room, disguised as decorative items and hidden in places where they would capture clear audio and video of the entire evening. I also arranged for Amanda to be nearby with federal agents ready to move in if my parents became dangerous when they realized what was happening. The most challenging part was getting my parents to confess without making them suspicious that I knew anything. I had been playing the role of the grateful, slightly naive daughter for weeks, but I needed to push them to reveal more without breaking character. My opportunity came when my grandmother started talking about how worried the whole family had been during my disappearance and how grateful everyone was that I had survived such a terrible ordeal. Mom and Dad were both drinking wine, relaxing into the warmth of family approval and sympathy. "You know," I said carefully, "I have been thinking a lot about what happened in the mountains, and there are some things I still do not understand. Like why you left me at that campsite instead of bringing me back to the car when I got sick." Mom's expression flickered for just a moment before she recovered. "Honey, I was in panic mode. I was not thinking clearly. I thought I was going for help, but I got confused in all those trails." My grandfather frowned. "But you hiked that area when you were younger, Sarah. You know those mountains better than most people." This was perfect. Family members who knew Mom well were already questioning her story. I pressed gently. "And I keep wondering why you did not come back for me once you realized I was not behind you." "It was 8 days, Mom." Dad jumped in quickly. "The ranger said the weather was too dangerous for searching in some areas. And your mother was devastated, absolutely devastated. She blamed herself completely." "Did she?" my aunt asked pointedly. "Because I remember when we talked on the phone during those 8 days, you seemed remarkably calm for someone whose daughter was missing in the wilderness." I could see Mom starting to get defensive, which was exactly what I needed. "I was in shock," she said. "People process trauma differently. I was barely functioning." My uncle, who worked in insurance, had been quietly listening to this exchange. Suddenly he spoke up with something that made my heart race. "Sarah, did not you just increase Scarlett's life insurance policy a few months ago? I remember you asking me about different carriers and coverage amounts." The silence that followed was deafening. Mom's face went white and Dad looked like he was about to be sick. I could see them exchanging glances, trying to figure out how to respond to this unexpected line of questioning from family members they had not expected to be suspicious. "That was just... We were reviewing all our policies after your father's business troubles started," Mom stammered. "We wanted to make sure everyone was adequately covered in case something happened to one of us." But my uncle was not satisfied. "A $500,000 policy on a 16-year-old seems like quite a lot, especially when you are facing financial difficulties. Most people would reduce their insurance expenses during tough times, not increase them." I knew this was the moment. Everything depended on how I played the next few minutes. "Wait," I said, trying to sound confused rather than accusatory. "You took out life insurance on me right before we went camping, and then you left me alone in the mountains." The room was completely silent now. Every adult present was staring at my parents, and I could see the dawning realization on their faces that something was very, very wrong with this story. Dad tried to salvage the situation. "Sweetheart, you are making connections that are not there. The insurance was completely separate from the camping trip. What happened in the mountains was a terrible accident." "Then explain to me exactly how this accident happened," my grandmother said firmly. She was a retired school principal, and her voice carried the authority of someone who had spent decades catching people in lies. "Explain how you accidentally left your daughter 3 miles from the car at a campsite that required hiking to reach with enough supplies for only 2 days and then forgot about her completely." Mom finally cracked under the pressure. "It was not supposed to happen like that," she burst out. "It was supposed to be quick, and she was supposed to just... It was supposed to look like she got lost and could not find her way back." The entire room erupted. My grandmother gasped. My grandfather started shouting. My aunt grabbed her phone to call the police. But I needed more. I needed them to confess to everything. "Mom," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "are you saying you left me there on purpose? Are you saying you were trying to kill me?" And then in front of 8 family members and hidden cameras that were recording everything, my mother completely broke down and confessed. She told them about the insurance policy, about their financial desperation, about how they had planned my death to look like an accident. She told them about Dad's construction fraud, about the lawsuits and criminal charges they were facing, about how my death was supposed to buy them time to disappear before anyone could catch them. Dad tried to stop her, but it was too late. The truth was spilling out of her like poison from a wound, and everyone in the room was hearing exactly what kind of people they really were. When she got to the part about planning a second attempt on my life, my grandfather called the police himself. The federal agents and Amanda arrived just as the local police were taking statements from everyone present. The timing was perfect. My parents were arrested that night for attempted murder, and the federal task force executed their raid on Dad's construction company the next morning, armed with all the inside evidence we had provided. But the story was far from over. The arrests were just the beginning of a legal and personal reckoning that would expose decades of lies, fraud, and manipulation that went far beyond what I had originally suspected. The federal investigation that followed my parents' arrest uncovered a web of corruption so vast and systematic that it made national news. What I had initially thought was just construction fraud turned out to be part of a multi-state conspiracy involving bribed officials, falsified safety reports, and buildings that were literally death traps waiting to collapse. Within 48 hours of the raid on Dad's company, 3 other construction firms were also raided across Colorado and Wyoming. The FBI had been building this case for over 2 years, waiting for the right insider evidence to move forward. Our recordings and documents provided the missing pieces they needed to connect all the players involved. But it was what they found in Dad's office safe that truly shocked everyone, including me. Hidden behind false financial records were detailed plans for at least 6 other insurance fraud schemes involving family members of his business associates. My attempted murder was not some desperate, spur-of-the-moment decision. It was part of a calculated pattern of using family members as unwitting insurance victims. Amanda called me with updates every day as more evidence surfaced. They found emails between Dad and his partners discussing which family members would be easiest to eliminate without suspicion. They had targeted elderly relatives, disabled family members, and in one case, a business partner's autistic teenage son. The cold-blooded nature of their planning was beyond anything I could have imagined. Mom's confession at our family dinner had been recorded by our hidden cameras, but it turned out the FBI had been monitoring their communications for months as part of the larger investigation. They had recordings of conversations where Mom and Dad discussed timing my death to coincide with Dad's trial dates, believing that jury sympathy for a grieving father would work in his favor. The media attention was overwhelming. Our story became a focal point for the larger investigation because it involved attempted murder of a child by her own parents. News crews camped outside our house for weeks. I did interviews with 3 major networks and 2 documentary filmmakers who were covering the construction fraud scandal. During one particularly intense FBI debriefing, Agent Rodriguez showed me a folder containing evidence I was not prepared for. "Scarlett, we need to tell you something about your camping trip that might be difficult to hear," she said gently. "Your parents had backup plans in place in case you somehow survived the initial abandonment." The folder contained receipts for climbing equipment purchased under false names, maps of remote cliff areas, and detailed weather reports for the week I was missing. If the exposure and starvation had not killed me, they had planned to stage a hiking accident by pushing me off a cliff and claiming I had fallen while trying to find my way back to them. They were monitoring search and rescue communications through a police scanner, Agent Rodriguez continued. They knew exactly where the search teams were looking each day, and they had planned to find your body in a location that would support their story about you falling accidentally. The revelation that they had been actively working to ensure my death, even while pretending to be frantic with worry, was devastating. But it also filled me with a cold satisfaction, knowing that every cruel calculation they had made was now being used as evidence against them. Marcus was struggling with the aftermath in his own way. At 14, he was old enough to understand that our parents had tried to murder his sister, but young enough that the betrayal was completely overwhelming. He started having nightmares and panic attacks, and we both entered therapy to deal with the trauma of learning that the people who were supposed to protect us had been our greatest threat. Our extended family stepped up in ways that probably saved both of us. My grandparents hired the best criminal attorney they could afford to ensure that Mom and Dad received the maximum sentences possible. My aunt and uncle took temporary custody of Marcus and me, providing the stable home environment we desperately needed during the trials. The financial investigation revealed that Mom and Dad had been stealing from family members for years. They had taken money from my college fund, emptied Marcus's savings account, and even stolen jewelry from my grandmother during family visits. Every act of generosity from our relatives had been met with calculated theft and manipulation. But perhaps the most stunning discovery came when investigators looked into the life insurance policy Mom had taken out on me. The insurance company had been suspicious of the timing and amount of the policy, especially given our family's sudden financial troubles. They had actually flagged it for potential fraud investigation, but had not acted quickly enough to prevent what almost became my death. The insurance investigator, Maria Santos, told me something that gave me chills. "Your mother called our office 3 days after you went missing," she said. "She wanted to know exactly what documentation would be required to process a claim in the event of your death. She was already planning to collect the money before your body was even found." As the federal case built momentum, more victims came forward. Families who had lost relatives in building collapses that Dad's company had declared structurally sound. Workers who had been injured because of safety violations that Dad had covered up. The human cost of their greed extended far beyond our family. The media coverage intensified when other families involved in the insurance fraud conspiracy began speaking out. I appeared on a national morning show alongside the mother of the autistic teenager who had been targeted. Hearing her story made me realize how lucky I was to have survived and escaped. Mom and Dad's defense attorneys tried every strategy they could think of. They claimed financial desperation had driven them temporarily insane. They argued that the camping trip abandonment was not premeditated. They even tried to suggest that I had misunderstood innocent conversations and blown them out of proportion. But the evidence was overwhelming. Hours of recorded conversations, financial records showing the systematic planning and physical evidence of their backup murder plans created a case that was impossible to defend. Their own words, captured on the recordings Tyler had helped me make, destroyed every lie their lawyers attempted to construct. The preliminary hearings alone took 3 months, during which more co-conspirators were arrested and more victims were identified. What had started as my personal fight for survival had become a federal case that would reshape construction safety regulations and insurance fraud prosecution across multiple states. By the time the actual trials began, Mom and Dad were facing charges that carried potential sentences of life in prison without parole. The attempted murder charges were just the beginning. Federal racketeering charges, insurance fraud conspiracy to commit murder tax evasion, and criminal negligence in multiple building collapses meant they would never see freedom again. But I was not satisfied with just seeing them punished. I wanted them to face the full consequences of what they had done to everyone they had hurt, and I wanted to make sure that their story served as a warning to anyone else who thought they could murder family members for money and get away with it. The trials began 11 months after my parents' arrest, and the prosecution built their case like a masterpiece of legal strategy. They started with the construction fraud charges, methodically proving that Dad had knowingly used substandard materials and falsified safety inspections on dozens of buildings over a 15-year period. The first witnesses were families whose relatives had been killed or seriously injured in building collapses that could have been prevented. A woman named Patricia Coleman testified about losing her husband when a walkway collapsed at a shopping center Dad's company had certified as safe just weeks before the accident. Her testimony was devastating, and I watched Dad's face crumble as she described finding out that her husband's death was completely preventable. But it was when they moved to the attempted murder charges that the courtroom atmosphere became electric with tension. The prosecutor district attorney, Rebecca Martinez, played our hidden camera recordings of Mom's confession at the family dinner. Watching 12 jurors hear my mother casually admit to planning my death was surreal and satisfying in equal measure. Marcus testified about overhearing the insurance conversations before our camping trip. His voice shook, but he was clear and detailed about exactly what he had heard. When Mom's defense attorney tried to suggest that a 14-year-old might have misunderstood adult conversations, Marcus looked directly at our mother and said, "I know what I heard. She said it would look like an accident if Scarlett just disappeared in the mountains." The FBI agents presented evidence that chilled the entire courtroom. They had recovered deleted text messages between Mom and Dad discussing the timing of my death, including messages sent while I was still missing that referred to me in past tense, as if I were already dead. Agent Rodriguez testified about the backup murder plans, showing the jury photographs of climbing equipment and detailed maps with marked cliff locations. The defendants had contingency plans in place to ensure the victim's death, even if the initial abandonment failed, she explained. This was not a crime of passion or desperation. This was calculated, premeditated murder with multiple scenarios planned in advance. But the moment that broke the case wide open came when the prosecution called Mom's sister, my Aunt Jennifer, to testify. Jennifer had been reluctant to get involved initially, but she finally came forward with information that revealed the true scope of their planning. Sarah called me 2 weeks before the camping trip. Jennifer testified, tears streaming down her face. She asked me hypothetical questions about what would happen to Scarlett if something happened to both her parents. She wanted to know about custody arrangements, inheritance laws, and life insurance policies. When I asked why she was thinking about such morbid topics, she said she was just worried about providing for her children's future. Jennifer continued. Then she asked me if I thought Scarlett would be better off with a large inheritance and no parents, or alive with parents who could not afford to send her to college. She made it sound like a philosophical question, but now I realize she was testing whether I would support her decision if I knew what she was planning. The defense tried to paint Mom as a loving mother driven to desperation by financial circumstances beyond her control. They brought in character witnesses who testified about her involvement in school activities and community volunteer work. But every positive statement about her character was immediately undermined by the recorded evidence of her coldly planning my death. Dad's defense strategy was even more pathetic. His attorneys argued that he was just following Mom's lead, that she was the mastermind behind the murder plot, and he was merely a weak-willed accomplice. They tried to portray him as another victim of Mom's manipulation. This backfired spectacularly when the prosecution presented evidence that Dad had been planning insurance fraud schemes involving family members for over 3 years before they targeted me. Phone records showed him discussing similar plots with business partners, and financial records proved he had taken out life insurance policies on elderly relatives who later died under suspicious circumstances. The moment I had been waiting for came when I was called to testify. I had prepared for this for months, working with victim advocates and attorneys to make sure I could tell my story clearly and completely. Walking to the witness stand, I looked directly at both my parents. Mom was crying, but Dad would not meet my eyes. I testified for 6 hours over 2 days, walking the jury through every detail of the camping trip, my survival in the mountains, and my gradual discovery of what my parents had really done. When the defense attorneys tried to suggest that I might have misunderstood or exaggerated what I had heard, I was ready for them. "I have recordings," I said simply. Hours and hours of recordings of them discussing how to kill me and make it look like an accident. You can hear them planning my death in their own words. There is nothing to misunderstand or exaggerate about recordings of your parents discussing the best methods to murder you. The prosecution played selected excerpts from the most damning recordings, and I watched the jury members' expressions change from skepticism to horror to anger. One juror was visibly crying when they heard Mom discussing whether my death would generate enough sympathy to delay Dad's criminal trial. Cross-examination was brutal, but I had been preparing for it for months. The defense attorneys tried to paint me as a vindictive teenager, seeking revenge against parents who had made a terrible mistake. They suggested that I had manipulated the evidence or taken conversations out of context. "My parents tried to murder me for insurance money," I said clearly when they finished their questions. "They planned it for months, they executed their plan, and when I survived, they immediately began planning to kill me again. These are not the actions of people who made a mistake. These are the actions of people who saw their child as nothing more than a financial asset to be liquidated when convenient." The closing arguments took place on a Friday afternoon in late spring, almost exactly 1 year after I had been found in those mountains. The prosecution methodically reviewed every piece of evidence, every recording, every document that proved premeditated attempted murder. The defense made one last desperate attempt to generate sympathy for two parents facing life in prison, but the jury was out for only 3 hours before returning with guilty verdicts on all charges. When the foreman read guilty for each count of attempted murder conspiracy to commit murder, insurance fraud, and racketeering, I felt something I had not experienced since waking up alone in those mountains, complete safety. Mom collapsed when the verdicts were read. Dad just sat staring straight ahead like he could not process what was happening. But I was not done with them yet. I had prepared a victim impact statement for the sentencing hearing that would ensure they understood exactly what they had done and how it felt to be betrayed so completely by the people who were supposed to love me most. The sentencing hearing took place on a crisp October morning, exactly 18 months after my parents had left me to die in the Colorado mountains. The courtroom was packed with family members, media, and other victims of Dad's construction fraud. I had spent weeks preparing my victim impact statement, and I was ready to finally tell my parents exactly what their betrayal had cost me and what I thought of them as human beings. Judge Patricia Walsh called me to the podium, and I looked directly at Mom and Dad as I began to speak. They were both wearing prison uniforms, having been held without bail since their conviction. Mom looked like she had aged 10 years, but Dad still carried himself with the arrogance that had characterized him throughout the trial. "Your Honor, 18 months ago, I was a normal 16-year-old girl who trusted her parents completely and believed that family meant unconditional love and protection," I began. Today, I am someone who survived a premeditated murder attempt by the two people who brought me into this world and who spent my entire childhood promising to keep me safe. I continued, my voice growing stronger with each sentence. But I want to be very clear about something. While my parents tried to destroy me, they actually created something. They never expected a person who refuses to be a victim, who understands the value of real family versus blood relations, and who will spend the rest of her life making sure that other families do not suffer what mine suffered. I detailed the lasting impact of their betrayal, the trust issues, the nightmares, the way I now analyzed every relationship for signs of manipulation or hidden agendas. But I also talked about the strength I had discovered, the genuine family I had found in my grandparents and extended relatives, and the sense of purpose that came from helping other victims of family violence find justice. The irony is that you tried to kill me for money to solve your financial problems, but your actions have cost you everything, I said, looking directly at them. You lost your freedom, your family, your reputation, and any chance of ever being remembered as anything other than the parents who tried to murder their own daughter for insurance money. When I finished my statement, Judge Walsh asked if my parents wanted to address the court before sentencing. Dad declined, but Mom stood up and tried one final manipulation. She apologized tearfully, claimed she had been temporarily insane from financial stress, and begged for mercy for the sake of Marcus and me. I had prepared for this moment, too. When the judge asked if I wanted to respond to Mom's statement, I stood up again. Your Honor, my mother just demonstrated exactly why she deserves the maximum sentence possible, I said. Even now, she is trying to use Marcus and me as props in her manipulation. She is claiming that her attempted murder of me was somehow motivated by love for her children. That is not mental illness or temporary insanity. That is the mindset of a person who sees her children as objects to be used for her benefit, even in her final court appearance. Judge Walsh sentenced Mom to life in prison without the possibility of parole for the attempted murder charges, plus 30 additional years for the fraud and conspiracy charges. Dad received life without parole plus 40 years. They would both die in prison, which was exactly what I had hoped for. But the most satisfying moment came after the sentencing, when Agent Rodriguez told me about the larger impact of our case. The federal investigation that grew out of my parents' crimes had resulted in 43 additional arrests, new federal regulations for construction safety inspections, and a complete overhaul of insurance fraud detection systems. Your courage in investigating and exposing your parents saved lives, she told me. The buildings that would have been constructed with substandard materials, the families who would have been targeted for insurance fraud, none of that will happen because you refuse to stay silent. Marcus and I moved in permanently with our grandparents, who provided the stable, loving home environment we needed to heal from the trauma. Marcus thrived in therapy and eventually became an advocate for children who had experienced family violence. Our bond as siblings grew stronger than ever as we supported each other through the healing process. The college fund that my parents had stolen was restored through restitution payments, and several universities offered me full scholarships after hearing my story. I chose to study criminal justice and victim advocacy with plans to become a prosecutor specializing in family violence cases. 2 years after their sentencing, I received a letter from Mom in prison. She was still trying to manipulate me, claiming she had found religion and wanted to reconcile. I burned the letter without reading past the first paragraph. Some people deserve forgiveness, but some actions are unforgivable, and attempted murder of your child for money definitely falls into the latter category. I started speaking at conferences about family violence and insurance fraud, sharing my story to help other victims recognize warning signs and find the courage to seek help. The most rewarding part was hearing from other young people who had survived family betrayals and were inspired by my story to pursue justice against their abusers. Tyler, who had been instrumental in helping me gather evidence against my parents, became my boyfriend and eventually my fiancé. He understood better than anyone how the experience had changed me. and he supported my decision to dedicate my career to helping other victims. Amanda, the paralegal who had connected us with federal investigators, became a lifelong friend and mentor. On the third anniversary of being found in those mountains, I hiked back to the location where the search team had discovered me. But this time I was not alone and afraid. I was with Marcus Tyler and my grandparents celebrating not just my survival, but the strength and family bonds that had grown from the ashes of betrayal. Standing in that spot where I had nearly died, I realized that my parents had unknowingly given me the greatest gift possible: absolute clarity about what real family means, unshakable confidence in my own strength, and a purpose in life that was bigger than anything I had imagined before they tried to kill me. The mountains that were supposed to be my grave became the place where I learned that some people are worth trusting with your life. Some fights are worth every sacrifice it takes to win them. And sometimes the worst thing that happens to you becomes the foundation for the best thing you ever accomplish. Have you ever experienced a family betrayal that changed how you see relationships forever? Have you had to learn that blood does not always mean loyalty, and that chosen family can be stronger than biological family? Drop a comment below and share your story. You might help someone else who is struggling with family drama realize they are not alone. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life stories about overcoming impossible situations and finding strength you never knew you had. Share this with anyone who needs to hear that survival is possible. Justice can be served, and sometimes the people who try to break you end up making you unbreakable instead. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember that your worth is never determined by how others treat you, even when those others are supposed to love you most. Stay strong, trust your instincts, and never stop fighting for the life and respect you deserve.